in the fall of 2005. I was on an airplane and I was flying from where I lived in Albuquerque, New Mexico, up to Seattle to visit a client. I worked for a company. We did public health software, and I was going to the King County Department of Health office to work with them on their vaccine registry and disease surveillance projects. What's interesting is back then we used to talk about the idea of pandemics as almost as a conceptual idea, and what would we do if we ever had to distribute large amounts of vaccine to people who all desperately wanted it? Like, what would that look like? And it was an interesting thought exercise back in the day that, frankly, I'm sort of glad we went through, and I'm hoping someday soon the thoughts that we came up with back then may actually get to be put into practice. That's actually not what we're talking about today, though, at all. Just an interesting aside for you. But I was on the airplane, like I normally do, and sometimes when you're on the plane, depending on your mood going in, you may put your headphones on, and you're like, I really don't want to talk to anybody. But sometimes you're a little bit more open. This was a day where I really just wanted to put my headphones on, right? Like I didn't really want to talk to the person who was going to sit next to me. I really just wanted to, get where I needed to go as fast and efficiently as possible. So I did that. I sat down and I got my iPod out, because those were the iPod days. And I put my headphones in, and I was sitting there and started to read my book and until the plane took off. And then eventually the flight attendant came around, asked if you wanted something to drink. So I took my headphone out and asked and responded, said, yes, I want a Diet Coke, because who doesn't want a Diet Coke? And while I was doing that, the guy who was sitting next to me looked over and asked, that question, what are you reading? Which is like the universal airplane greeting for, do you want to have a conversation? Right? I mean, that's the opening line to anybody. What are you reading or what are you listening to? It's like the opening line of somebody who obviously wants to talk. So I told him, I don't honestly remember what the book was, and we do get to talking, and what I figure out very quickly is this man is very excited about the work that he is doing, and very excited about where he's going. He's going to a big meeting to meet with a big donor. He worked for this nonprofit that worked with kids. He was super excited about it, and then he finally asked me, what do I do? And I said, well, I'm a software engineer, and he looks at me, he's like, oh, I used to do that. And I was like, what? He's like, yeah, I used to work in software during like the big .com bubble. But I got out, and now I'm doing this now. And I can very much remember sitting in that seat with the thought going in my head, like, you're allowed to do that? Like, they won't stop you? And I'm not sure who I thought they were by any means, but it was this kind of revolutionary idea. And looking back on it, I can understand why it was. At that point, one of my biggest role models had been my grandfather. My grandfather went to college, got a job as an engineer at Lockheed Martin, and stayed there pretty much his whole life. And as far as I knew, like, that's what you did. And I had actually already changed companies once. And so the idea that you could not only change companies, but that you could change like careers, in your adulthood was probably like mind-blowing to me. And I said, no, this is my path. This is what I do. Now, for those of you who have heard a couple of sermons I've done about my time spent responding to Hurricane Katrina, that was a very seminal experience in my life, and it happened. That actually happened a couple of months before. My son had just been born. So there are always these kind of life disruptions, and there was already this sort of like thing going on in me, and things that were not were churning and bubbling, and I wasn't sure where they were going. And so here was this person exposing me to these thoughts and ideas about what life could be like and what's possible in life that I'd never considered before. And I couldn't help but notice like how happy he was, and how hard he was working, and how passionate he was about what he did. And I began to wonder, like, I wonder what it would be like to have that sort of passion for life, that sort of passion for what I do. Do I have passion for what I'm doing? I like what I'm doing. But is it my calling? Can I think about it in those terms. And so that led me on a path that will eventually, actually, frankly, lead me here. Now, I think sometimes we have these moments, right? And we have these moments where, our mind is opened up in a new way, where we are inspired in a new way, where we suddenly allow ourselves to indulge in a new way, preferably a better way, of thinking about the world and how it works and our place in it. And sometimes those experiences come where we expect them to, and sometimes they come in really unexpected places, including a plane flight that you've been on so many times that it's actually, you consider it rather boring. Now, I sometimes struggle to put, too much providence out there in the world, but I do think in some ways that conversation that I had, whether that man knew it or not, he was being the ambassador in many ways of the Holy Spirit. Like, he was tapping me on the shoulder to give me a message that God needed me to hear. And had I let my headphones in, I may have just missed it. Thankfully, I did not. Today's story is from the Bible. It's actually about a very similar experience. It's about a man, Moses, who most of us know, going about his daily life and doing things that I'm sure he considered rather boring, which of course was tending the sheep, because that's what he did. Now, he also had a bit of a tumultuous background. At this point in Moses' story, he's actually a man on the lam, right? He actually murdered a couple of people back in Egypt. He's fairly sure the Pharaoh's mad at him or after him, so he's laying low in a place outside of Pharaoh's control, and he's taking on this rather mundane life and taking on the life of a rancher, and he's tending these sheep, and he's going about things that, frankly, I'm sure he's done at that point 1,000 times, and isn't expecting, by no means expecting, anything interesting to happen this day, because nothing really, I'm sure, interesting happened all the previous days. So when he's out there and he sees a bush, and it's a bush like any of the other hundreds of bushes he's no doubt seen that day, he does take notice of it because it's a little different, right? Like it says that it appeared to be on fire but did not burn, whatever it is that means, right? So, I mean, obviously that's a little out of the ordinary. Like, that is going to catch your attention. And he has a choice. He can either ignore it, he can put his, headphones in, if he had headphones, which of course he didn't, and keep on walking, or he can decide to investigate. And he does. And he walks closer, and then we get this great encounter where Moses hears God's voice. And one of the first things God says is, "Moses, take off your shoes. This is holy ground." This is holy ground? No. I mean, frankly, it's not. It's dirt in the middle of the desert with a bush on it. That patch of ground that Moses was standing on, he would recognize that no more as holy than I would recognize, seat 20 on Southwest Airlines flying between Albuquerque and Seattle, right? I mean, God makes this crazy statement. Moses, take off your shoes. You're on holy ground. And I gotta imagine the first thing he said was, really? Because I'm pretty sure one of my lambs just pooed over there. Sorry. But come on. But of course, he's smart. Moses is smart enough to do it, right? And of course, and we don't have this tradition in our culture now, but you'll still find it in a lot of places in the world, especially in Southeast Asia and India and places like that, where when you enter into a special place, you do take your shoes off. It's considered rude or sacrilegious to wear shoes into sacred spaces. Right? So Moses complies. He takes his shoes off and he goes. And he has this amazing encounter with God because he was standing on holy ground, even though he didn't recognize it. Now, the thing about that moment, and the thing about that space, isn't that space had always been holy ground and Moses had failed to see it. No. It was holy and sacred ground because of what happened there and because of what God chose to do with that space and what God chose to reveal to Moses in that space. It wasn't predetermined. If Moses had walked left out of the corral instead of right, the bush in the sacred ground would have been over there instead of over there. Our faith tells us, our relationship with God tells us that God has this amazing ability to make anywhere, even the most ordinary and everyday spaces, holy ground. Now, in my life as a pastor, there's a conversation I have from time to time with people, and it generally goes about the same way. And maybe there's somebody I haven't seen in a little while, or whatever. Just somebody who just doesn't seem like their normal selves, and I will talk to them. And I'm like, hey, what's going on? And they're like, oh, we're fine. Everything's fine. I was like, hey, maybe I run into them at the supermarket. And I'm like, hey, I haven't seen you in church in a while. Everything okay? I'm like, yeah, it's okay. And then if the conversation goes on and off, they eventually begin to kind of sheepishly admit something along the lines of, we just really haven't been feeling it in church lately. It's church really isn't doing it for us right now. And I hear these things and I'm like, okay, and I know that they're afraid I'm going to take that personally, or they're worried that somehow that makes them like a bad Christian, or whatever. And I'm like, and so oftentimes people are surprised when I generally respond like, yeah, I know. It's sometimes it feels that way for me too. Sometimes it just kind of feels like you're going through the motions. And oftentimes there's this big, almost sigh of relief. They're like, really? Yeah, I think that happens to everybody. Hopefully it doesn't happen for long, but certainly we all go through phases like that, where we just feel like those places in our lives that are supposed to be special and sacred just don't feel that special and that sacred. And sometimes I have to go so far as say, look, maybe that's not where God is for you right now. Maybe God's somewhere else for the moment. And they look at me and they're like, really? So here's the problem. I love worship space. I love, one of the things every time I visit a church, the first thing I always want to see is the sanctuary and see how they have it arranged and see, if they've got stained glass windows or if it's a more modern space, if they got pews, if they got chairs, what the pulpit looks like. I love standing behind, a nice, good pulpit, which is sort of funny because as most I don't actually preach from one, but there's something about standing there with that thing in front of you, and I love those spaces and they are sacred and they are important and you can walk into some. I've been blessed to walk into several cathedrals in Europe and you walk in and you're just like, oh my gosh, you're just overwhelmed by the space. So I love those spaces, but I also imagine if you lived and worked out of that cathedral, there would be some days where you just walked in and it was kind of just that place that you lived or that place that you worked. We all have those times and those moments. And I think the challenge for us is to recognize that as important and sacred as some spaces are, whether that's the sanctuary or whether that's that favorite lake that you like to visit or wherever it is, those places that you recognize in your life as special and meaningful, right? Just because just because those are typically special and meaningful places doesn't mean that they're always going to be. And I think sometimes if we constrain, we can take on a constraint where we're like, oh, well, that's the special place that I go to commune with God. And if I'm not feeling it there, that must mean that God's not around. I don't think that's what it means. I think one of the things that we've been on in the journey that we've been on over this last several months is learning how to make sacred space, special space with God, in all sorts of ways. I've heard no end of stories about, sometimes they're joking like, oh, we really like church in our pajamas. Like, okay, that's fine. I've heard stories about families who are like, man, worship now looks like the whole family gathered on the big bed, cuddled together and watching worship together. And I'm like, wow, that sounds really special. That sounds like sacred space. And yet at the other time, we have people who I know, and I'm definitely one of them, who are like, we miss being in our space. We miss being in the space that we recognize, and the pews that we know, and the bricks that we love to look at. We miss being in that place because it is familiar and it feels like home. And what in life is more sacred and more special than those places that feel like home? Which is why I'm excited we're, at least on a very limited basis, going to be able to start greeting people back to that space. But I think no matter what, I think the story, the lesson we learned from Moses, and the lesson I learned on Southwest Airlines in the fall of 2005, is that we should never constrain God. We should never constrain where we can encounter God, and we should never limit it in our minds that we will miss out on the burning bush or the chatty seatmate that God places into our lives. We should never be so constrained in how we think God works, or how God works with us, or how God speaks to us, that we miss it when God is clearly trying to. I think that's the challenge, not just of this time, but it is simply the challenge of life. It is too easy and too convenient to constrain God or our faith into these specific acts that happened at these specific times, and everything else is somehow different. The truth is, if God can take a bush at a random piece of ground in the middle of a desert, surrounded by sheep, and make that sacred space so important that one needs to take their shoes off in order to approach it, then God can surely do it anywhere. Do it in our homes, do it in the car, yes, do it in the mountaintops and on the lake shores, do it in our church buildings, do it at the grocery store, wherever it is that we may be. So where in the world is God? That is the question we're asking ourselves this series. And so I'm just going to go ahead and spoil it for you right at the beginning, that there is an answer to the question, where in the world is God? Is God's everywhere. The question really honestly isn't, where in the world is God? The question is, are our eyes and hearts and minds open to seeing Him anywhere we happen to be? So over the next several weeks, we're going to look at different places that people have encountered God, most of them rather unexpected. And I think together we are going to see that where in the world is God? Well, God is anywhere we are willing to find Him. Amen.